Once this letter had been dictated, I proceeded to copy it neatly and took it to the emperor to have him sign it. With him was Dr. O'Meara. "Read this to me out loud, and intelligibly," he said to me. When I had finished, he said, "Well, doctor, what do you think?" "I think that such a letter will be very precious to its recipient, and that it is impossible to give a higher indication of favor and a more moving declaration of friendship." The letter was placed in an envelope sealed with the imperial seal and taken to Count de Montholon, to the duty officer to be sent to Count Las Casas. The officer sent it to the governor, who soon thereafter sent it back to Longwood, saying he could not receive sealed letters because his instructions forbade it. The emperor, informed of this situation by the Grand Marshal, who was returning the letter to him, broke the seal himself and told Count Bertrand to hand it over to Captain Poppleton, who took it himself to the governor. During all this time, and the time preceding Count Las Casas's embarkation, the emperor remained in his quarters much more than he was in the habit of doing. He informed the admiral who came to see him that he was ill and in bed. The host of the Briars, Mr. Balcombe, was more fortunate, and the emperor received him in his robe. He was a man who had offered his services and was disposed to continue doing so. He told me on leaving the emperor that he found him much changed. I replied that faced with the governor's conduct, it could scarcely be otherwise. The governor worried about a sequestration that did not allow the duty officer to verify the emperor's presence at Longwood. He came to find the Grand Marshal and immediately questioned him about the emperor. He described him as being ill and quite changed. Either Hudson Lowe had considered the bad impression the removal of Count Las Casas would create in Europe, or after reading the emperor's letter to him, he better understood the necessity of the services Count Las Casas had rendered the emperor. He again declared, as he had written 3 days before, that he had promptly offered to return Count Las Casas to Longwood, and the fact that he did not accept the offer made it his duty to repeat it again. The emperor had not wanted, at first, to believe Count Las Casas's refusal to accept the offer to come back to Longwood. The governor's new declaration no longer allowed any doubt of it. The emperor first wanted to write to him, then preferred to let him do as he pleased, believing that if he left St. Helena, it was because he was certain to serve him better in Europe than he could here. D. Eurotas, carrying on board Captain Piatkowski, Archambault, Santini, and Rousseau, arrived from the Cape and dropped anchor before sailing for England. Permission had been granted Archambault to go see his brother. The emperor called him in and learned from him that Captain Piatkowski and his companions were very poorly treated on board. The emperor's bad mood was worsened by this and only increased his anger at seeing Count Las Casas' affair not coming to an end. The emperor, having learned on the 26th that Count Las Casas had gone into town and was preparing to embark, sent the Grand Marshal and General Gourgaud to see him. The decision to leave the island had been made by Count Las Casas, who believed it was an opportunity for him to let Europe know of Sir Hudson Lowe's improper conduct. The decision was reported to the emperor and prompted him to send a letter to Sir Hudson Lowe through the Grand Marshal, asking him to allow Count Las Casas to come to Longwood and say goodbye to him. The governor replied immediately that Count Las Casas was free to return and remain there, but that he could not agree to his going there if he insisted on leaving. As all attempts for the emperor to see Count Las Casas before his departure had been unsuccessful, and December 30th, 1816 had been fixed as the date of his embarkation, the emperor again sent the Grand Marshal and General Gourgaud into town. They were presented to the governor by Sir Thomas Reed and granted authorization to see Count Las Casas in the presence of Mr. Gourgaud and Wynyard, the governor's staff officers. Count Las Casas was happy to see them again, assured them once more he would be more useful to the emperor in Europe than he could possibly be here, and was quoted the last words the emperor conveyed to him: "If he leaves, that will please me. If he remains, that will please me." Gourgaud and Wynyard kept themselves at a distance so they would not be uncomfortable in exchanging expressions of friendship. This allowed Count Las Casas to give to the Grand Marshal the diamond necklace the emperor had gotten from Queen Hortense when leaving Malmaison, of which he was the depository. He added a draft on London for 100,000 francs for the emperor's needs. The sum of 400,000 francs he had previously given along with the last sum, were reimbursed by Prince Eugene, who held some funds belonging to the emperor. 3 days apart, 2 ships left Jamestown Harbor. One on December 30th took Countess Casas and his son to the Cape. The other, having arrived a few days earlier, carrying Captain Pinkowski and his companions, sailed on January 3rd, 1817, for England. When these gentlemen came back from town, they reported to the emperor Countess Casas' words and handed him the diamond necklace, whose fate the emperor had not known, having never talked of it to Countess Casas since he had given it to him. However, after his abduction, searches were made in his apartment in the belief that he might have hidden it in his furniture or behind some woodwork. But these were to no avail. Countess Casas, when he received it, had placed it around his body, and it had remained there ever since. This necklace, which the emperor estimated was worth around 200,000 francs, is the one he bequeathed to me in his will. On returning home that evening, he gave it to me, asking me to put it away in the secret compartment of his travel kit. That same day, we sadly numbered 6 people less in our little colony of Longwood. That evening, the emperor went into his room to go to bed and told me to read a few pages from The Chinese Embassy by Lord Macartney, the book on his table. After an hour's reading, he was about to fall asleep and told me to retire. For a month after Countess Casas had been taken from Longwood, when the emperor went into his room, he was accompanied by Count de Montsalon or General Gourgaud, as he had previously been by Countess Casas. He would chat with them 45 minutes or an hour and then invite them to retire. If it so happened that neither of them went in, he would ask me to read either a serious work or a novel that he designated himself. As the obstacles he had encountered in his desire to see Countess Casas return to Longwood were no longer the governor's fault, his agitation calmed and he accepted the separation, as his last words intended to be repeated to Countess Casas bear witness to the sorrow of losing a friend, was joined the aggravation caused by the governor's brutal act carried out on the person of one of his officers. The moment the emperor knew the purpose of the arrest, he said to the Grand Marshal, "It is an act of savage brutality he will never dare execute. He will fear too much the repercussions it would have in Europe." The turn of events proved the emperor had judged the matter perfectly. The governor had offered to allow Countess Casas to return to Longwood. If the count had not, it was because he felt he would be more useful to the emperor in Europe than he could be by remaining with him. The emperor enjoyed Countess Casas' conversation very much. As he liked to live in his memories, he took pleasure in reminiscing with him about the delightful society which in his youth, he said, lent so much charm to a fireside conversation. Such was the end of the year 1816. One would think that after the events that had just occurred, the following years would have been exempt from similar tribulations. But the emperor's words to Count de Montsalon, when the previous April it had been necessary to sign the commitment to remain on St. Helena as long as the emperor's captivity lasted, seemed bound to come true. If it lasts a long time, the British may well have only the 2 of us to keep. January 1st, 1817, consummated a day of sadness for everyone. A time at which, looking back in the past, the ambassadors of all powers used to come in the name of their masters to express their friendship toward him, and behind them a pressing crowd of courtiers filled the vast drawing rooms of the Tuileries. Today, forced to seek shade under a tent erected close to his house, there being none elsewhere, he received not the caresses of a charming wife he loved, nor those of a son who represented all his hopes, but only the wishes, sterile but full of heart and soul, by few companions in captivity. The departure of one of these was too recent not to cast a veil of sadness over the compliments presented to him. Like the previous year, the emperor wanted the children to come have dinner with him and receive presents. The children, through their games and the happy carelessness of their age, were able to distract his painful thoughts and bring a smile to his lips. He sent Saint-Denis to ask me for various presents he wanted to give them. The children's happiness led him to also give gifts to the parents. He sent Saint-Denis to ask me for a Chinese checker set that he gave to Count Bertrand. A spyglass recently sent by his sister, the Queen of Naples, was offered to General Gourgaud, and a silver travel kit that he had had in Egypt to Count de Montsalon. Countess Bertrand and de Montsalon each received a plate from his fine Sèvres porcelain service. That of Countess Bertrand represented the passage of the Danube, whose bridges were built by the Grand Marshal. that given to Countess de Montallon showed a battle where her husband had particularly distinguished himself. I believe it was Austerlitz. In the morning, the emperor had received the compliments of Count de Montallon. When he came to ask him at what time they should present themselves, he had replied, I am in a tomb. I do not feel the heart for family celebration. He retired that evening, happy with the joy he had been able to bring to those around him. Countess Cassis's departure was to bring about changes in the emperor's habits. The workload that had been divided among 4 was now divided among 3. These gentlemen had their working hours, and things soon returned to usual. The emperor continued his conversations in the evening when he went to bed. General Gourgaud and Count de Montallon were generally the only ones called on for this. The Grand Marshal, although he lived within the Longwood enclosure, was housed outside the moat on the location of the new construction being built for the emperor. At 6 p.m., a wall of sentries separated him from us, and if the emperor summoned him at that hour, there was no way of getting him other than accompanied by a British soldier. The emperor's evenings in his private apartment were therefore shared exclusively with the 2 generals who lived at Longwood. And if it happened that the emperor, on retiring, should dismiss both of them, he became my responsibility. The emperor would have me take a book he was in the process of reading and tell me to continue reading it aloud. It happened. They were called at night to work, but in those days it was rare, as the emperor did not want to disturb them. He much preferred telling them when he saw them again the next morning. I have worked hard during the night, and you, lazy friend, what have you done? When you received such a greeting, you could be sure painful thoughts had left his heart and mind. I can say here without fear of contradiction that on this miserable rock, the emperor always exhibited great evenness of temper, and through his energy knew how to sustain that of others. Suspicious as he was, the governor could not stand having the duty officer remain more than 24 hours without catching sight of the emperor. Otherwise, he became anxious and arrived at Longwood at Count Montallon's quarters with his instructions in hand, demanding to see him. Count de Montallon would reassure him about his exaggerated fears and keep these scenes from the emperor. Had they been reported to him, the emperor would have remained at home to find out just how far Lowe would press his audacity and violate his domicile. As the emperor's apartment was on the ground floor, the duty officer, without having to approach the windows and without anyone suffering from his surveillance, during his walks around the house could spot the emperor in one or another of the rooms he occupied. Since the new restrictions, the emperor no longer saw any foreigners except the admiral and Mr. Balcombe. Dr. O'Meara was the only man at Longwood who could inform him of what was occurring on the island and bring him news of Europe that had arrived recently. His importance increased for the emperor, and his access to his private apartment thus became easier. The doctor deeply regretted, he said to me, the emperor's decision not to receive any of the foreigners who had a permit from the governor. He thus refused a means of distraction for himself, and that of making known in Europe, through those who came to visit him, the state of disrepair of the place where he had been lodged, while the governor was living in a sumptuous mansion. This comparison was a scandal to foreigners, and it was the reason the government made such a show in the newspapers about the wooden palace shipped from London to St. Helena. The governor was well aware of Dr. O'Meara's means of action, for he felt they went against the measures of isolation. Sir Hudson Lowe did not trust the emperor's health bulletins. He reproached the doctor with being too eager to carry out the small errands of the French in town. The doctor had previously told me he found himself between the anvil and the hammer. The trust he inspired in the emperor on the one hand, and on the other hand, the desire the governor expressed to him in private to bring about the rapprochement between himself and Longwood, made of him a message carrier. Depending on the question raised, these became more or less violent, and ended by bringing about his dismissal from Longwood. General Gourgaud, often on horseback, would meet island inhabitants or officers from the garrison during his outings. He was always asked with the greatest interest for news of the emperor. Among the commissioners who had come to St. Helena, the one he met the most frequently was Count Balmain, representing Russia. Although he was courting Lady Lowe's young daughter, born of a first marriage. He did not hide from General Gourgaud that the emperor's detention in St. Helena was not what the Allies had intended. They had indeed left it up to England to carry out the Treaty of August 2nd, 1815. But it was considered inhuman to nail the emperor to this rock in an area too small to allow him to take the exercise necessary to his health. He and his colleagues were moved by what they had learned, and Marquis de Montchenu had protested against such a state of affairs. There was therefore some reason to hope the former limits would be reestablished. When these words were repeated to the emperor, he was pleased, less by the freedom that might be restored to him than by the pleasure on the island, the presence on the island of eminent men who were reproaching the governor for the way his instructions were being applied. For his part, Count de Montsalon also brought back news. As he went out less on horseback, he was much more often with the emperor, to whom he was growing close. In addition to his work hours, he was in charge of correspondence, and Sir Hudson Lowe made it a busy one, so that it became an occupation and the source of long conversations between himself and the emperor. As for the Grand Marshal, of whom the emperor said, "We must love our friends, even with their shortcomings," he was a friend at heart. In spite of Count Bertrand's indecision in certain circumstances, the emperor's friendship for him was unchanged. The emperor knew he was a man of good advice and knew he could rely on him. He was devoted and incapable of departing from the path dictated by duty and honor. Count Bertrand was a wealthy man, surrounded by a large family of whom he took good care. He was not as close to the emperor as his two companions, but never a day went by without his coming several hours to see him and place himself at his disposal. Countess Cassis's departure resulted in Count de Montsalon and General Gourgaud becoming closer to each other. Their little disagreement ceased, at least in appearance, because of their common wish to provide the emperor with means of distraction. The time was spent in friendship, work, and rides, either on horseback with the Grand Marshal and General Gourgaud, or in the evening with the ladies in the carriage. The emperor was told to remark of the governors on the occasion of comments made by the commissioners, and whose content was, "I'm going to see to it that he's able to ride on horseback. I do not wish him to die of a stroke, which could be very embarrassing for me and for my government. I would prefer that he die of a lingering disease, which our doctors can easily confirm to be a natural one. A stroke would lead to too many comments. General Bonaparte cannot ride freely throughout the island if it were only a matter of his security. A simple delegate from the East India Company would have sufficed to keep him in St. Helena. He should consider himself fortunate that my government has sent a man as kind as I am to keep him. Otherwise, he would be in chains, to teach him to behave better." In that case, the emperor said to Dr. O'Meara, who had told him about this outburst on the part of the governor, "It is absolutely clear that if the instructions given to Mr. Lowe do not contain a written order to kill me, the verbal orders have been given. For if one wants to have a man die mysteriously, the first thing to do is to sequester him from any contact with society, to surround him with mystery, so that after having accustomed the world to not hearing of him and to forgetting him, it then becomes easy to torture him and have him disappear." The emperor sought through work and reading to calm the agitation of his mind, which conversation always brought about in spite of himself. If a ship was in sight in the harbor, he impatiently awaited Dr. O'Meara's return to find out where it came from and what was on board. Among the brochures sent to him was one entitled "The Secret Loves of Bonaparte." The emperor quickly read through it and tossed it in on the carpet, laughing. He said, "What a Hercules they make me out to be. There isn't a single line of truth." Mio's work on the Egyptian campaign attracted his attention. What was said in it about the poisoning of the plague victims in Jaffa is refuted in the story of the Egyptian campaign he dictated to the Grand Marshal. The emperor was nevertheless quite aggravated, leading him to call that author a scoundrel. Goldsmith, in his secret history of Napoleon Bonaparte's cabinet and the court of Saint-Cloud, received the same label. "Pilot," he said, "it is the work of an enemy pen, but there's some truth in it. It's a good book." The emperor, whose health was robust, was also stricken with dysentery. The symptoms became severe enough to frighten us, but soon went away. On that occasion, he said to Dr. O'Meara, "If I had taken your medicine, I would now be done for. My chicken broth and fasting are what saved me." Admiral Malcolm had not given up hope of reconciling the emperor and Sir Hudson Lowe. Dr. O'Meara, in his conversation, led him to believe it was possible, and if the governor was truly trying to take the first step, he sent for the personal use of General Bonaparte a small case of the highest quality Bourbon coffee. The governor begged the emperor to accept it, knowing he complained about his supplier. Cipriani and I thought the emperor would refuse it, and we were greatly surprised when Count de Montauban ordered it taken to the pantry. The admiral therefore came to Longwood, and trying by all possible means to open a door that had long been closed to Sir Hudson Lowe, he assured the emperor that the governor's desire had seemed sincere. Well then, the emperor said, tell him to restore things as they were in the days of Admiral Cockburn, and all will be forgiven. I have already given you such a message to take to him before, and it was without result, as this one will be.